Hi everyone. So I'm back after a week of being sick. If you can still hear it, I hope you don't mind. Um, while I was sick, I think everybody has read the files, probably, or came across certain sections of the files. Um, I did read them, and I did think for myself, well, what relevance is there in having these files outside, except to know how the elites think? And then I turned back to my favorite history teacher, Professor Jiang, and he had pretty interesting ideas in terms of seeing issues within our society based off these files. And I think the most interesting one, which we all don't necessarily really think about, is that our society is not really a society anymore, right? Like you live in a society that you genuinely don't feel any connection to because we have been taught to focus on ourselves, the individual. And that is also the only way that, for instance, capitalism can work because imagine if you started caring for other people, yeah, that's gonna cut off your working time and stuff, right? So you're only taught to think for yourself and about yourself. Is this a bad thing in itself? No. Does it make you weaker? Absolutely, right? Because if you look, for instance, at the French Revolution, right, and the wealth distribution, nowadays wealth distribution is much more unequal than during the French Revolution, right? Now, why don't we see a revolution where, we dethrone politicians, billionaires? That is because the French, and essentially everybody who was still doing these revolutions during that time, they acted as a society and they were not indoctrinated, right? Like they didn't go to schools and were taught that, well, hard work creates money, which doesn't. So they didn't have that, right? Like they were a society, they cared for each other, surprisingly, and they didn't go to certain schools and universities where they still preach about hard work and capitalism, which doesn't work for anyone now, except you're inheriting money. So that is an interesting, pressing issue, right? And now I could say, well, how do we fix this? The issue with being an individual comes from, I guess, social media, right? Because why would you be in favor of introducing these platforms where you might find inspiration, right? Like people find inspiration and knowledge on these platforms, that's a good thing. But apart from that, you are pretty much losing time. You are trying to be different than everybody else because that is your competitive advantage. And when you try to be so much different than everybody else, it also means that you will not find a society, right? Like I can tell you from my case, because I've moved cities quite a lot, I can tell you that I generally don't care where I am. I don't have homesickness because there isn't like no home to begin with. And a lot of people have the same feeling, right? Not necessarily in terms of towns, but in terms of countries. We have no anchors, essentially, like no cultural anchors, because if you're a migrant, you are told that, for instance, your culture and your identity, they're worthless. Like focus on being like the others. That's essentially what they're teaching you. And these measures with social media try to make you a one in a billion, which in itself is not a bad thing. But they make you weak because now you cannot connect with people to start doing meaningful things, right? Now you might counter argument and say, well, there are a lot of, demonstrations. Demonstrations in rare cases have ever amounted to anything. Fridays for Futures, did they do anything? Not really, right? Like it in Germany, for instance, I remember young people decided to glue their hands on streets, and they also did that on airports. Now, I can tell you that this didn't amount to anything because why would you be listening to young people fighting for solutions while gluing their hands on the street. Because that in itself is no solution, right? And also, these demonstrations, unfortunately, did not bring you any viable solutions. Like they tell you, well, you currently have like these regulations, please stick to them. But even with these regulations, you're not going to solve the environmental crisis, right? So that's kind of like a case study where I'm saying didn't help, actually. Same goes for wars, right? Like the thing is with wars and genocide, the West is very selective about it, if you didn't notice, and they generally don't care, right? Because the West in itself has not been a place for society to care for other people. Because you still have that in Asia, right? And I think I've talked about the book, which is called Outliers, which also explains, for instance, why certain Asians or certain Asian groups still believe in hard work equals success. That is because of their rice culture. Because if you were a farmer for rice plants, then obviously hard work equaled success, and success in you being not starving. That was essentially the whole mantra. And it worked well for them. And because they were a rice culture, you needed to be dependent on other people because you can't just farm rice on your own. Because these fields, they're so vast and so big, half your plants will be dying if you decided to, farm yourself. So I think Asia still has this community sense because they are rice culture, because thousands of years ago they still had to work together to, get rice and survive, essentially. I don't think that in Europe you have that, to be fair, um, because again, being individual and being different from everybody else is kind of like a capitalistic thing. I did talk, like I just mentioned that why, but again, while Asia does have capitalism, they still have, for instance, the notion of certain family practices where you can't really distance yourself from your family, right? Like you are always engulfed in some sort of societal change and action. In the West, that's not the case, right? Because I can tell you, I lived in Qatar and it was very much different because you suddenly had a lot of people you could converse with, people that actually cared for you and did comment on your actions. You don't have that in Europe and in the West for most cases because people here, they tend to distance themselves from everybody at a certain stage and only come back to these connections when they're alone, which happens when they grow old. And so that's, for instance, why these files were probably possible within the West. I don't think you could have seen these files to such an extent in Asia, for instance. Like it doesn't, I don't think it's possible based on the community feeling versus being an individual. So yeah, so we did talk about that. Now I did that too. Um, I think you can really make like story out of it with different parts because the other two issues that he talks about is that the elites that are on these files, they're friends, right? They know each other. Maybe through Epstein, maybe they knew each other beforehand. And Professor Jung also, he tells you that even the elites of countries that are at war with each other, they're friends. They have contempt for each other. You know, the kids go probably to La Rose in Switzerland together, same class. They go to the same colleges afterwards, so the only people they're fooling are us normal people. And they do that with media, they do that with politicians, they do that with introducing certain indoctrinations that we have never questioned because they seem so clear and they seem so logical, right? And if you do want to see maybe a more interesting argumentation on that, go to his YouTube channel, Professor Jung. I don't remember which video it was, but he talks about that. So it might be one of his news where he talks about the Epstein file. So you'll find it. Hmm. Apart from that, that's it. Um, if you stayed to the end, thank you. Feel free to subscribe. Um, this video was maybe one of the longer ones, and I do apologize if you didn't hear me clearly at all times. Um, I'm still sick, I think, even though I thought I'm not. But yeah, that's it. And thanks for sticking around. Bye.